everyone in this room is real upset. Maybe some tenants are quite pleased, but I'm really curious, most specifically, about the loophole that Sherwin spoke of, joining apartments, because right now we have numerous construction projects going on to do exactly that. Not everything in construction goes according to timelines that we've planned, and what we're really worried about is, are they going to shut that loophole, and are they also possibly going to roll things back, or are they going to say, you know what, we didn't go far enough? What do you guys think?
Nobody knows what's going to happen. I can tell you what's been stated on the various tenant advocacy group agendas. There were 4 big items that I keep reading over and over. Good cause eviction, eliminate MCIs altogether, eliminate IAIs altogether, because that $83.33 is just exorbitant, and do something about reconfiguration. So what could they do? They could put a cap on what the new rent would be. I don't know legally how they could eliminate the first rent for an apartment that didn't existed before being a freely negotiated rent. I'm not sure legally how that could be done, but could they put some sort of cap on it, saying that if the prior apartment was renting for $1,500 and the one next to it was renting for $1,500 and market was $4,500, no, you limit it to $3,000? Could they say that? I suppose they could try. I know everybody's saying it's cyclical, but right now I think the cycle is unfortunately in a real anti-owner progressive mode. You have overwhelming majorities in both houses. It's not 1 or 2, the Republicans held on to the state Senate by 1 or 2 seats, and largely because of the IDC for a number of years. You're talking about a wave took over both houses. I mean, one leader of a real estate industry group has said, I don't think in my lifetime I'm going to see a Republican-controlled Senate again. If you don't see that, I'm glad you're optimistic, but I could see a lot more bad happening before there's a recognition that we've gone too far. And I just wanted to make a response. Someone said that the various real estate groups tanked or didn't. I mean, I was involved with every one of the major real estate groups during the negotiations. There was a vigorous effort put in to try to stop the tide. But this was a typhoon. I was in the room with politicians. I could have been talking to the walls. It was meaningless. The presentations were meaningless. This was a preset agenda. These laws were happening. One of the great unfortunates was that Governor Cuomo said, instead of being the adult in the room, said, whatever you put in front of me, I will sign. Nobody's quite sure why he did that. But with overwhelming majorities in both houses, I mean, I think the Assembly is a lost cause. The Assembly is never going to be Republican. And unless the Senate goes Republican so that there's some real negotiation and give and take, I think you're dealing with years of potential anti-owner legislation. I hate to be depressing, but that's what my question is.
Yeah, Sharon, before we all get too depressed, why don't we talk about the lawsuit? Because it's one of the things.
We'll be meeting on a windowsill later.
One of the things we didn't talk about was the pending litigation, which I think is interesting. The last time that rent regulation was challenged constitutionality-wise was in 2010 in the Harmon case. And at the time, then District Attorney Eric Schneiderman wrote a 26-page brief explaining why the law was constitutional. Every single example he used in that brief discussing why the law was constitutional was overturned in this most recent rent reform. So it would seem like the lawsuit does have some pretty good legs, but it has to lose in New York Circuit and District Court before potentially getting to the Supreme Court. And if politicians move to disallow people from not renting apartments that would even enhance the likelihood of success. But why don't you give an update on the litigation?
So there's actually 2 lawsuits that have been brought, and I believe a third will be brought in the coming weeks. The first lawsuit that was brought was an RSA CHIP lawsuit. And that lawsuit was, and both RSA and CHIP have said, that lawsuit was really being thought about for the past several years. It was really one of the spurs of that lawsuit was when the New York State Court of Appeals referred to rent stabilization as a public subsidy program. Using that language kind of creates the thought, well, if it's a public subsidy, why is a subsidy on the back of a private industry? So that began thought about rent stabilization generally. And the RSA CHIP lawsuit is really a lawsuit that was going to be brought whether the recent statute was passed or not. And that lawsuit essentially says, we've been in a temporary housing emergency since 1947. The temporary housing emergency has not been abated by rent stabilization. It doesn't work. If it doesn't work, it's irrational and it constitutes a taking. So it's really a global challenge to rent stabilization with the HSTPA changes added on. And that was filed in Eastern District Court. There's a briefing schedule. I think the state answers sometime in January. There was a more recent suit brought about 10 days ago, which is a suit more focused specifically on the HSTPA, the recent change in law, pointing out individual items that constitute takings. I think the 2 suits, are very complementary because one is kind of macro, one is micro. They're both brought in Eastern District Court. I don't know if the second one was brought in Eastern District with the idea maybe the 2 lawsuits get consolidated. I think it was brought in, frankly, I think it was brought in Eastern District Court because the Eastern District is considered more conservative than the Southern District. But, those lawsuits are going to be years in the making till there's a determination. Clearly, the goal is to get to the U.S. Supreme Court. You have a conservative majority right now in the U.S. Supreme Court. Last summer, there was a case that was determined which gave a hint of anti-rent regulation. Ruth Bader Ginsburg is up in years. If our president doesn't get impeached and can appoint another conservative justice, it would then be a 6-3 conservative majority. So clearly the game is within the next couple of years to get to the U.S. Supreme Court and have a fresh look at rent regulation, both from a macro and micro perspectives taken. And it'll be interesting to see how it's viewed.
Yeah, and it's not just a New York thing. California has statewide rent regulation. Oregon just recently implemented statewide rent regulation.
And unfortunately, rent regulation is becoming now part of a national dialogue. Bernie Sanders is in favor of national rent regulation, AOC, national rent regulation. So it's no longer just our problem. And you're seeing good cause eviction pop up in 5 jurisdictions.
Other questions?
What happens then? All of a sudden now we have all free market leases. What's
a windfall?
Karen?
Well, I think the point that the legislature has kind of lost sight of is that there are developers out there who do affordable housing very well. And why not partner up with them and incentivize them to build and add supply to market, because that's really the only thing that's going to resolve the issue, rather than impose a regulation on everyone. So I think that would be the next step in terms of this. And realistically, a few people mentioned, things were a little dark in the 60s, but there weren't as many options back then. If your capital wasn't coming to New York, you weren't going to Atlanta or Texas or all these options that are here now.
Well, my assumption is what would be declared unconstitutional would be these rent regulations. But that doesn't mean that all rent regulation is unconstitutional. My assumption, and I mean, we're talking about quite a hypothesis that it's declared unconstitutional. My assumption is some form of regulation will be enacted. It may be less onerous than what is declared unconstitutional, but I talk about crystal ball, I just don't see that everything just becomes the Wild West and it's free market.
I think also, just following up on your comment, I think there are some developers that do affordable housing, building affordable housing well. I think it's also important to note that there were some developers that were in that room feeding the advocates and the legislator information, telling them, hey, you can renovate an apartment for $15,000. So, you know, they had a certain conflict of interest. They want more affordable housing built, and they want the rent-stabilized housing stock to be hurt. But I also think not just those affordable developers, but we have some of the biggest firms in the world that build housing in New York, right? And I think at some point you have to have these people come together, whether it's the relateds and the left-racks of the world, with the legislative, the electeds and the advocates, and you have to have a real solution, because this Housing Act is not the solution. So, and I think the answer is building. And so why not have people that have built the biggest projects in the world tackle this and build hundreds and hundreds of thousands of apartments, and at the same time have a rent stabilization law that's in place that incentivizes owners to put money into the building. And if you do that, then you're helping residents. And I think that the real trick is convincing elected officials that there is another path.
I think that's a great point, Douglas. Hi, Rita, you had a question?
All of us in this room are playing defense, which is not the position that you want to be in. And I hear all the legislation that's being proposed for January is just going to make the situation worse with market rate regulation of market rate apartments, commercial leasing, and office leasing as well. The bright minds on the panel, what can we do to change the conversation such that real estate doesn't have this huge target on its back, and we're not the Goldman Sachs type villains of 2019, 2020. How do we change the conversation so that it is a partnership with government to try and solve the problem? And isn't it better for us to try and self-regulate the way Facebook and Amazon and all the technology companies are trying to do, rather than government coming in and regulating us for us? So if you guys have suggestions as to how we can, people in this room and outside of this room, try and change the conversation and the tide of opinion to steer it towards a better place sooner rather than later, because waiting for the market to change, I mean, that's a 30 to 50 year time horizon. Far beyond what most people in this room want to wait for. So change will come, the pendulum will eventually swing back. How do we facilitate that? How do we make the near term less painful for us?
Anytime you have the ability to have a conversation with an elected official or policymaker, try to explain to them what you're seeing, the way you see the market, the way you see things working. Hopefully tenants will get on board, because if the quality of life for them in their buildings is degrading, hopefully they'll speak up about that, because clearly conditions for residents in multifamily housing, the conditions are not going to get better under the new laws. It's one of the unintended consequences. So I think the more vocal people are, I think one of the interesting things is that, a very high-ranking politician in the state told me that the real estate industry is too passive, that we write letters and things like that, and that if you go up to Albany 3 or 4 times a week, there are groups protesting. And he said, ask the protesters what they're protesting, and 80% of them won't know what they're protesting. They're paid to get on a bus, they get a free lunch, they go up, hold signs up, and at the end of the day they go home, but that's impactful on decision makers in Albany. So maybe we need to be a little more vocal. I don't know if anyone on the panel has anything to add, but I think that is a great question about what do we do moving forward to try to affect some change that would be great for everybody in the city?
I mean, one thing I've repeatedly suggested to the real estate industry groups is, since landlords, owners are being demonized right now, I mean, the notion you take money from a real estate company, you're evil as a politician. I think to the extent that the trades and the contractors and the unions that have lost work and jobs can be out there as bodies showing the actual effects of what has occurred, of not just I might lose my job, I did lose my job, or I'm a contractor, I used to remodel 10 kitchens a month. It's now 1. It's gone. My livelihood is gone. I think those sorts of real life examples may resonate more than just landlords saying, you know, you're really hurting our bottom line. I think showing real people power and people hurt could be a real positive.
I also think, for, you know, going back to your point, for a long time the industry relied upon a couple of people sitting in a room kind of carrying our water. And I think that we've gotten to a point where collectively we all have a tremendous amount of assets. I think we all care about the people that live in our buildings and our buildings themselves and the neighborhoods. And I think it's time that we, you know, work with groups like REBNY and we say, look, we want a voice in what's going on and we want to do this the right way. And then you could end up in a long-term, much better place. But I think that narrative has to be changed, because I think over time, real estate in this city has done tremendous good. And I think that's getting lost in the shuffle because you've got a couple of rotten apples who took advantage.
Yeah, and I think on that note, I'm going to wrap it up for today. I think that, you know, knowing that we hopefully can affect some change by being vocal, by expressing opinions, by speaking to people who can make legislative changes is a great way to get started. And we'll see what happens. It'll be interesting. I think we may reconvene in another 4 or 5 months when we have some good data points about how the market has changed. Will be very insightful. And I thank you all for coming today. Have a wonderful day.